the 7th through the 8th, the Theban frigate arrived from the Cape and brought us some newspapers. I translated them to the emperor while we walked in the garden. One of these papers brought intelligence of a great catastrophe. I read that Murat, having landed in Calabria with a few troops, had been seized and shot. At this unexpected news, the emperor interrupted me by exclaiming, "The Calabrians were more humane, more generous than those who sent me here." This was all he said, and after a few moments' silence, seeing that he said nothing, I continued to read. Murat, without real judgment, without solid views, without a character proportioned to the circumstances in which he was placed, had perished in an attempt evidently desperate. It is not impossible that the emperor's return from Elba may have turned his brain and inspired him with the hope of renewing the prodigy in his own person. Such was the miserable end of him who had been one of the most active causes of our reverses. In 1814, his courage and intrepidity might have saved us from the abyss in which his treachery involved us. He neutralized the viceroy on the Po and fought against him, whereas by uniting together, they might have forced the passes of the Tyrol, made a descent into Germany, and arrived on Bau and the banks of the Rhine to destroy the rear of the Allies and cut off their retreat from France. The emperor, while he was at Elba, disdained all communication with the king of Naples, but on departing from France, he wrote to inform him that being about to resume possession of his throne, he felt pleasure in declaring to him that all their past differences were at an end. He pardoned his late conduct, tendered him his friendship, sent someone to sign the guarantee of his states, and recommended him to maintain a good understanding with the Austrians and to content himself with merely keeping them in check in case they should attempt to march upon France. Murat, at this moment, inspired with the sentiments of his early youth, would receive neither guarantee nor signature. He declared that the emperor's promise and friendship were sufficient for him, and that he would prove he had been more unfortunate than guilty. His devotedness and ardor, he added, would obtain for him oblivion of the past. Murat said the emperor was doomed to be our bane. He ruined us by forsaking us, and he ruined us by too warmly espousing our cause. He observed no sordid discretion. He himself attacked the Austrians without any reasonable plan, without adequate forces, and he was subdued without striking a blow. The Austrians, when rid of Murat, cited his conduct either as a reason or as a pretense for attributing ambitious views to Napoleon when he again appeared on the scene. They constantly referred to Murat whenever the emperor made protestations of his moderation. Before these unlucky hostilities of the king of Naples, the emperor had already set on foot negotiations with Austria. Other inferior states, which I think it unnecessary to mention by name, had signified to him that he might rely on their neutrality. Doubtless, the fall of the king of Naples gave another turn to affairs. Endeavors have been made to represent Napoleon as a man of furious and implacable temper, but the truth is that he was a stranger to revenge, and he never cherished any vindictive feeling. Whatever wrong he suffered, his anger was usually vented in violent transports and was soon at an end. Those who knew him must be convinced of this fact. Murat had scandalously betrayed him. As I have already observed, he had twice ruined his prospects, and yet Murat came to seek an asylum at Toulon. I should have taken him with me to Waterloo, said Napoleon, but such was the patriotic and moral feeling of the French army that it was doubtful whether the troops could surmount the disgust and horror which they felt for the man who had betrayed and lost France. I did not consider myself sufficiently powerful to protect him, yet he might have enabled us to gain the victory. How useful would he have been at a certain period of the battle for what was required at certain moments of the day to ensure our success? To break through 3 or 4 English squares, and Murat was admirable in such a service as this. He was precisely the man for it. At the head of a body of cavalry, no man was ever more resolute, more courageous, or more brilliant. As to drawing parallels to the emperor between the circumstances of Napoleon and Murat, between the landing of the former in France and the entrance of the latter into the Neapolitan territory, no such parallel exists. Murat could have had no good argument to support his cause except success, which was purely chimerical at the time, and in the manner in which he commenced his enterprise, Napoleon was the chosen ruler of a people. He was the legitimate sovereign according to modern doctrines. But Murat was not a Neapolitan. The Neapolitans had not chosen Murat. How, therefore, could it be expected that he would excite any lively interest in his favor? Thus, his proclamation was totally false and void of facts. Ferdinand of Naples could view him in no other light than as an instigator of insurrection. He did so, and he treated him accordingly. How different was it with me, continued the emperor. Before my arrival, one universal sentiment pervaded France, and my proclamation on landing was imbued with that sentiment. Everyone found that it echoed the feelings of his own heart. France was discontented. I was her resource. The evil and its remedy were immediately in unison. This is the whole secret of that electric movement, which is unexampled in history. It had its source solely in the nature of things. There was no conspiracy, and the impulse was general. Not a word was spoken, yet a general understanding prevailed throughout the country. Whole towns threw themselves at the feet of their deliverer. The 1st Battalion, which my presence gained over to me, immediately paced the whole army. In my power, I found myself borne on to Paris. The existing government and its agency disappeared without effort, like clouds before the sun. And yet, concluded the emperor, had I been subdued, had I fallen into the hands of my enemies, I was not a mere insurrectionary chief. I was a sovereign acknowledged by all Europe. I had my title, my standard, my troops, and I was advancing to wage war upon my enemy. The 9th, in the papers which I was translating to the emperor, I found the history of the Spanish general Porlier, one of the most distinguished chiefs of the famous guerrillas. He had made an attempt to excite the Spaniards to rise against the tyranny of Ferdinand, but he failed, was arrested, and hanged. The emperor said, I am not in the least surprised that such an attempt should have been made in Spain. Those very Spaniards who proved themselves my most inveterate enemies when I invaded their country, and who acquired the highest glory by the resistance they opposed to me, immediately appealed to me on my return from Elba. They said, fought against me as a tyrant, but they now came to implore my aid as their deliverer. They required only a small sum to emancipate themselves and to produce in the peninsula a revolution similar to mine. Had I conquered at Waterloo, it was my intention immediately to have assisted the Spaniards. This circumstance sufficiently explains to me the attempt that has lately been made. There is little doubt, but it will be renewed again. Ferdinand, in his madness, may grasp his scepter as firmly as he will, but one day or other it will slip through his fingers like an eel. We had now finished our perusal of the newspapers. The emperor began to turn over the leaves of my atlas, and I was happy to see him examine the genealogical tables. I had long wished to call his attention to them, but he had always passed them over. I analyzed to him on the English table the wars of the houses of York and Lancaster, which are unintelligible to many readers without a help of this kind. He was struck with their utility and examined several of them. With regard to the Russian table, he observed that it is extremely difficult without such an assistant to trace the irregular orders of succession among the late sovereigns of Russia. On looking over the French table, he was very much surprised at the singular fact that in spite of 7 or 8 enforcements of the Salic law, Louis XVI should have reigned as though that law had never existed. The emperor dwelt much on the accurate and complete agreement of these tables with one another. He frequently adverted to the number of rallying points marked in so small a space, the numerical order of the sovereign, his degree of succession, the complete list of his ancestry, etc. He repeated what he had said before, hinted to me that he had known the value of these tables. He should have engaged me to arrange them in a more convenient and less expensive form in order to adapt them to the use of the French lyceums. He added that he should have liked to see all histories reprinted with similar documents to assist and explain them. I told him that I had entertained the same idea, that it had already been carried into execution with Hume's History of England, and that had it not been for the late events in France, it would also have been applied to Flefeld's History of Germany, Hanaut's France, and a history of the 3 crowns of the north. About 4 o'clock I presented to the emperor the captain of the Theban who was to sail next day for Europe, and Colonel McCoy of the regiment of Ceylon. This brave soldier looked like a mutilated monument. He had not only lost one of his legs, but his face was disfigured by a saber cut across his forehead and several other scars. He had been wounded on the field battle in Calabria and made prisoner by General Parthenau. The emperor received him with particular attention. It was easy to see that they felt a mutual sympathy for each other. Colonel McCoy had held the rank of major in the Corsican regiment commanded by the new governor, whom we expected. The colonel remarked to some person that he thought the emperor was very ill-treated here, but that he had too high an idea of General Lowe's liberality of mind not to believe that, having accepted the government of the island, he would do everything in his power to ameliorate our condition. The emperor afterwards rode out on horseback, and when we again went up the valley and did not return until about 7 o'clock, the emperor then resumed his walk in the garden. The temperature was very mild, and the moon shone delightfully. The fine weather had completely returned. The 10th. The emperor now begins to make rapid advancement in English, and with the assistance of his dictionary might manage tolerably without me. He was delighted with the decided progress he had made. His lesson for today was a task of reading in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the article on the Nile, of which he now and then made memoranda to assist him in his dictations to the Grand Marshal. In this article, the emperor found a fact related which I had formerly mentioned to him, but which he had hitherto considered as an absurd story. The great Albuquerque proposed to the King of Portugal to turn the course of the Nile previous to its entrance into the valley of Egypt, so as to make it fall into the Red Sea, which would have rendered Egypt an impassable desert, and made the Cape of Good Hope the only channel for the great trade of India. Bruce thinks the execution of this gigantic idea not entirely impossible. The emperor was forcibly struck with it. About 5 o'clock, the emperor took an airing in the calash. The drive was extremely pleasant, and the circumstance of some trees having been cut down has, by forming several circuitous roads, made our original space 3 times as large as before. On our return, we took advantage of the fineness of the evening to walk for a long time in the garden. The conversation was most interesting. It turned on various important subjects, viz. the variety of religions, on the spirit that had given them birth, the ridiculous absurdities with which they were mingled, the excesses by which they had been degraded, the objection that had been urged against them, etc. The emperor treated all these subjects with his usual superiority. 11th. The emperor read this morning the article entitled Egypt in the encyclopedia and made some notes from it, which cannot fail to be of service to him for his campaign of Egypt. This circumstance gave him a great deal of pleasure, and he repeated several times in the course of the day how much he was delighted with the progress he had made. He is now sufficiently advanced to read without assistance. About 4 o'clock, I accompanied the emperor into the garden. We walked by ourselves for some time, but we were afterwards joined by the rest of the company. The weather was very mild. The emperor remarked the calmness of our solitude. It was Sunday, and no workmen were to be seen. He added that we could not at least be accused of dissipation or of the ardent pursuit of pleasure. In fact, it is difficult to imagine a state of greater uniformity or a more complete absence of every sort of amusement. The emperor endures this mode of life admirably. He surpasses us all in equality and serenity of temper. He says to himself that it would be difficult to be more philosophical and tranquil than he is. He retires to bed at 10 o'clock and does not rise, that is to say, does not go out before 5 or 6 o'clock, so that he was never more than 4 hours out of doors, like a prisoner who is led from his cell once a day to breathe the fresh air. But then how intense is the occupation of each day? How various are the thoughts which occupy his mind during his long solitary hours. With regard to mental exertion, the emperor said he felt as capable of bearing it as he had ever been, that he did not feel himself worn out or withered in any respect. He was astonished himself at the slight impression that had been made on him by all the late events in which he had been the principal actor. It was like lead which had passed over marble. The spring might have been for a moment compressed, but it had not been broken, and had risen again with all its elasticity. He did not think anyone in the world knew better than himself how to yield to necessity. This, he said, was the real triumph of reason and strength of mind. The hour for hour had arrived. As the emperor was going to meet the calash, he happened to see little Hortense, Madame Bertrand's daughter, with whom he's very much pleased. He called her to him, caressed her 2 or 3 times, and took her out in the carriage along with little Tristan de Montsalon. During the drive, the Grand Marshal, who had been looking over the papers, gave an account of some bon mots and caricatures he had found among them. One possessed a good deal of point. The picture consisted of 2 actions. One represented Napoleon giving to the Princess of Hassfield, with directions to commit it to the flames. The letter, whose disappearance was to preserve her husband, underneath was written, tyrannical act of a usurper. The companion was quite of another character. We described to the emperor a great number of the caricatures with which we had been inundated after the Restoration. Some of them afforded him great amusement. One in particular made him smile. It referred to a change of dynasty. The emperor observed that if caricatures sometimes avenge misfortune, they form a continual annoyance to power. I think I have had my share of them, said he. He then desired us to describe some of those which had been made upon him. Very much approved of one as being in good taste. It was a sketch representing George III on the coast of England, throwing an enormous beetroot in great passion at the head of Napoleon, who was on the opposite shore, and saying, "Go and be made sugar." The 12th, fine weather had now fairly set in. About 4 o'clock, the emperor walked in the garden. The temperature was delightful, and we all acknowledged that it was like one of our finest evenings in Europe. We had enjoyed nothing equal to it since we had been on the island. The emperor ordered the calash, and by way of a change, instead of driving along the gum trees to get into the road leading to the Grand Marshal's house, he wished to take the road which encircles the upper hollow of our favorite valley, and to gain if possible the spot on which is situated the residence of Miss Mason, and which is on the opposite side facing Longwood. The emperor invited Madame Bertrand to take a drive in the calash, in which Madame de Montsalon and myself were already seated. The rest of our party followed on horseback, so that we were all now assembled together at a few paces from Madame Bertrand's at the military post, which is established near the house. The ground was very steep and uneven. The horses refused to advance, and we were obliged to alight from the calash. The barrier was scarcely wide enough to allow the carriage to pass, but the English soldiers came to our assistance, and in a moment pushed it through by main force. However, when we reached the hollow of the valley, we found walking so agreeable that the emperor wished to continue it, and after a short time he ordered the carriage to be driven along the road as far as the gate of Miss Mason's house, while we proceeded with our walk in the valley. The evening was really most delightful. The shades of night were beginning to overspread the sky, but the moon shone brilliantly. Our walk reminded us of those strolls which we had been accustomed to enjoy on fine summer evenings in the neighborhood of our country residence in Europe. The calash had now returned, but the emperor declined getting into it. He directed that it should wait at Madame Bertrand's door. But when the emperor got there, he wished to walk on the Longwood, where he arrived very much fatigued. He had walked nearly 6 miles, which is a great deal for him, who never was accustomed to walk at any period in his life, the 13th to the 16th. I already observed that there is no regular course of seasons in St. Helena, but merely irregular successions of good and bad weather. It would be difficult to find 4 words to express any deviation from our accustomed routine during these 4 days. And here I take the opportunity of observing once for all that if in the course of my journal the events of several days are occasionally found combined in one article, it's because I have canceled a portion of the notes relating to each day separately. I have been induced to do this from various motives. Sometimes my notes appear to be too puerile. Sometimes, on the other hand, they seem to be too serious and calculated for a more distant period. Or occasionally they consist of personalities, and I make it a rule studiously to avoid everything of that kind, if in spite of all my care, any offensive personal allusions have escaped me. It can only be when I've been led to them by the essential object of my journal, namely, to describe the character of the emperor. Even then, I may reflect for my own satisfaction that these personalities relate only to public characters and refer to facts already circulated in the world. I am, however, perfectly well aware that the task I have undertaken may subject me to many inconveniences, but I consider it as a sacred duty and shall endeavor to fulfill it to the best of my abilities, happen what will. 17th, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the emperor mounted his horse, and we rode round the park, commencing in the neighborhood of our valley, and proceeding as far as the road leading from the camp to the Grand Marshal's residence. A party of about 150 or 200 sailors belonging to the Northumberland, who were daily employed in removing planks of wood or stones for the service of Longwood or the camp, ranged themselves in a line, fronting Marshal Bertrand's house. While the emperor passed by, the emperor spoke to the officers and smiled complacently on his old shipmates. They appeared delighted at seeing him. I have already mentioned that we occasionally received parcels of newspapers from Europe, the contents of which occupied our attention, and occasioned the emperor to draw some lively and animated pictures. Conversing today on the subject of the intelligence we had recently received, the emperor observed that the condition of France was by no means improved. The Bourbons, he repeated, have now no other resource than severity. 4 months have already elapsed. The Allied forces are about to be withdrawn, and none but half measures have been taken. The affair has been badly managed. A government can exist only by its principle. The principle of the French government, evidently, is to return to old maxims, and it should do this openly. In present circumstances, the chambers above all will be fatal. They will inspire the king with false confidence, and will have no weight with the nation. The king will soon be deprived of all means of communication with them. They will no longer follow the same religion, nor speak the same language. No individual will henceforth have a right to undeceive the people with regard to any absurdities that may be propagated, even if it should be wished to make them believe that all the springs of water are poison, and that trains of gunpowder are laid underground. The emperor concluded by observing that there would be some juridical executions and an extreme desire of reaction which would be sufficiently strong to irritate but not subdue, etc. As to Europe, the emperor considered it to be as violently agitated as it had ever been. The powers of Europe had destroyed France, but she might one day revive through commotions arising among the people of different nations, whom the policy of the sovereigns was calculated to alienate. The glory of France might also be restored through a misunderstanding among the allied powers themselves, which would probably ensue. As to our own personal affairs, they could only be improved through the medium of England, and she could only be induced to favor us by political interests. A change in her ministers or her sovereign, or the sentiment of national glory excited by the torrent of public opinion. As for political interests, circumstances might bring them about. The change of individuals depends on accidents. Finally, with respect to the sentiment of national glory, so easy to be understood, the present ministry had disavowed it, but another might not be insensible to it. The 18th, the emperor sent for me about 10 o'clock. He had just returned home. Someone had informed me that he had been out shooting, but he said he had not. He rode out on horseback as early as 6 o'clock, but he gave orders that His Excellency's slumbers should not be disturbed. We set to work with the English lesson. Breakfast was served up. It was most detestable, and I could not refrain from making the observation. He pitied me for making so bad a meal. and added that it was certainly necessary to have a good appetite to make a repast on such fare. We continued our lesson until nearly 1 o'clock, when the excessive heat obliged us to desist and take a little repose. About 5 o'clock, the emperor went out to walk in the garden. He began to draw a sketch of the happiness of a private man in easy circumstances, peacefully enjoying life in his native province. In the house, and surrounded by the lands which he had inherited from his forefathers, certainly nothing could be more philosophic. We could not refrain from smiling at the tranquil domestic picture, and some of us got our ears pinched for our pains. Felicity of this kind, continued the emperor, is now unknown in France, except by tradition. The revolution has destroyed it. The old families have been deprived of this happiness, and the new ones have not yet been long enough established in the enjoyment of it. The picture which I have sketched has now no real existence. He observed that to be driven from our native home, from the fields in which we had roamed in childhood, to possess no paternal abode, was in reality to be deprived of a country. Someone here remarked that the man who had been robbed of the home which he had created for himself after the storm had blown over, who was driven from the house in which he had dwelt with his wife, and which had been the birthplace of his children, might truly say that he had lost a second country. How many individuals are reduced to that extremity, and what vicissitudes the present age has produced! We seated ourselves in the calash and took our accustomed airing. During dinner, the conversation turned on two young ladies, residents of the island, the one tall, handsome, and very fascinating, the other not so pretty, but perfectly well-bred and pleasing in her deportment and manners. Opinions were divided respecting them. The emperor, who was only acquainted with the first one described, declared himself in her favor. Someone remarked that if he were to see the second, he would not be induced to change his mind. The emperor then wished to know the gentleman's own opinion respecting the ladies, and he replied that he was an admirer of the second. This seemed rather contradictory, and the emperor requested him to explain himself. Why, said he, if I wished to purchase a slave, I should certainly fix on the first, but if I thought I should derive any happiness from becoming a slave myself, I should address myself to the second. That is to say, resumed the emperor quickly, that you have no very high opinion of my taste or manners? Not so, sire, but I suspect your majesty's views and mine would be different. The emperor smiled and said nothing more on the subject. The 19th, the emperor rode on horseback very early this evening. It was scarcely 6 o'clock when he went out. I was quite ready, for I had ordered someone to call me, and the emperor was astonished to see me so active. We strolled about the park at random and returned about 9 o'clock. The sun was already beginning to be warm. About 4 o'clock, the emperor wished to take his English lesson, but he was not very well. He said everything had gone wrong with him today, and that nothing had done him any good. His walk in the garden did not restore him. He was not well at dinner time. He did not play his usual number of games of chess, but retired indisposed after the first game. The 20th. The weather has been extremely bad. The emperor had been rather unwell the whole of the night, but felt himself much better in the morning. He did not leave his room before 5 o'clock. About 6, we took advantage of a gleam of fine weather to drive around the park in the calash. The horses, which have been provided for us, are vicious. They shy at the first object that comes in their way and become restive. They stood still several times during our drive. The rain indeed had rendered the roads very heavy, and at one time it required all of our efforts to obviate the necessity of returning on foot. The Grand Marshal and General Gargau were in one instance obliged to alight and put their shoulders to the wheel. At length, after a great deal of trouble, we reached home. The conversation during our drive turned on the island of Elba. The emperor spoke of the roads he had made and the houses he had built, which the best painters of Italy begged as a favor to be permitted to adorn with their works. The emperor observed that his flag had become the first in the Mediterranean. It was held sacred, he said, by the Barbary ships, who usually made presents to the Elba captains, telling them that they were paying the debt of Moscow. The Grand Marshal told us that some Barbary ships having anchored off the island of Elba had caused great alarm among the inhabitants, who questioned the pirates with regard to their intentions and ended by asking them plainly whether they came with any hostile views against the great Napoleon. Said the Algerines, "Oh, never! We do not wage war on God." Whenever the flag of the island of Elba entered any of the ports of the Mediterranean, Leghorn excepted, it was received with loud acclamations. All the national feeling seemed to return. The crews of some French ships from Brittany and Flanders, which touched at the island of Elba, testified the same sentiment. "Everything is judged by comparison in this world," said the emperor. "The island of Elba, which a year ago was thought so disagreeable, is a paradise compared to St. Helena. As for this island, it may set all future regret at defiance." The 21st through the 22nd, the emperor continued to rise early and ride out on horseback in the park and among the gum trees. He rode only at a walking pace, but his light exercise was of advantage to him, as it enabled him to enjoy the fresh air. He returned with a better appetite and pursued the occupations of the day with greater spirit. He breakfasted in the garden under some trees which had been twined together to afford him shade. One morning, as he was sitting down to breakfast, he perceived at a distance the Pole Piontkowski and sent for him to breakfast with him. He always takes pleasure in conversing with him whenever he meets him. Piontkowski, with whose origin we are not very well acquainted, came to the island of Elba and obtained permission to serve as a private in the guards. On the emperor's return from Elba, he had gained the rank of lieutenant. When we departed from Paris, he received permission to follow us, and we left him at Plymouth among those who were separated from us by the order of the English ministers. Piontkowski, having more fidelity or more address than his comrades, obtained leave to come to St. Helena. The emperor had never known and never spoken to him till he came here. Piontkowski was indeed equally unknown to us all. The English were surprised that we did not give him a warmer greeting on his arrival. Some individuals, who seized all opportunities of saying anything to our disadvantage, wrote to England that we had received Piontkowski very ill. This story was totally false, but it furnished the English ministerial prince with something on which to exercise their usual courtesy and wit. It was asserted that the emperor had beaten Piontkowski, and I heard of a character in which Napoleon was exhibited thrusting his nails into the Polish officer, while I had fallen upon him to devour him, and that it was only by a stick being thrust between my teeth by the keeper of the beasts that I was prevented from biting a mouthful out of his shoulder. Such were the elegant accounts that were given of us. The 24th, after dinner, while we were taking our coffee, the emperor observed that about this time last year he quitted the island of Elba. The Grand Marshal informed him that it was on the 26th of February and on a Sunday. "Sire," said he, "you directed Mass to be performed at an earlier hour than usual, that you might have the more time for issuing the necessary orders." They sailed in the afternoon, and next morning at 10 o'clock they were still within sight, to the great anxiety of those who were interested in their success. The emperor entered into conversation on this subject and was for upwards of an hour engaged in describing the details of that event, which is single in history, both from the boldness of the enterprise and the miracle of its execution. I shall insert at another part of my journal the particulars which I collected on this subject. The 25th to the 28th, our days were for the most part very much alike. If they seemed long in detail, they were rapidly shortened in the retrospective view. They were without character or interest and left only imperfect recollections behind. The English went on gradually improving. The emperor confessed that he had felt a moment of disgust, his furia francesi, as he said at one time, giving way, but he added that I had reanimated him by means of a plan which he considered more certain and infallible than any other, that of reading and analyzing one single page over and over again until it was thoroughly learnt. The grammatical rules were explained by the way. In this manner, there is not a moment lost to study and memory. The progress at first appears slow. The learner seems to advance but little in his studies. But by the time he has come to the 50th page, he is astonished to find that he knows the language. We had added a page of Telemachus to the rest of our lesson, and we found the benefit of it. By this time, however, the emperor, though he had only 20 or 25 complete lessons, could understand any book and would have been able to make himself understood in writing. He did not understand all that was said. It is true. But as he observed, nothing could be concealed from him for the future. And this was a great thing. This was a decided victory. The campaign of Egypt was completed with the assistance of Bertrand. As far as the want of materials would permit, the emperor now commenced with another of the gentlemen, a new and very important period, namely from his departure from Fontainebleau up to his return to Paris and his second abdication. He possessed no document relating to these rapid events, but it was that very rapidity which induced me to entreat him to employ his memory in recording circumstances which the hurry of events or party spirit might enfeeble or distort. The emperor also employed himself very frequently with me in revising the different chapters of the campaign of Italy. This is generally done immediately before dinner. He had directed me to arrange each chapter in a regular and uniform manner, to mark out the proper divisions of the paragraphs, and to note down and collect the illustrative articles. This he called the digestive business of an editor. And your interest is concerned in it, said he to me one day with an air of kindness which affected me. Henceforward, it is your property. The campaign of Italy shall bear your name, and the campaign of Egypt that of Bertrand. I intend that it shall add at once to your fortune and to your fame. There will be at least 100,000 francs in your pocket, and that your name will last as long as the remembrance of my battles. With regard our evenings, the reverses had been relinquished a second time. We could not continue it long. After the second or third round, the cards were abandoned for conversation. We resumed our readings. Our stock of novels was exhausted, and plays occupied our attention for the future. Tragedies in particular, the emperor is uncommonly fond of analyzing them, which he does in a singular mode of reasoning and with a great deal of taste. He remembers an immense quantity of poetry which he learned when he was 18 years old, at which time he says he knew much more than he does at present. The emperor is delighted with Racine, in whom he finds an abundance of beauties. He greatly admires Corneille, but thinks very little of Voltaire, who, he says, is full of bombast and tinsel, always incorrect, unacquainted either with men or things, with truth or the sublimity of the passions of mankind. At one of the couchés at St. Cloud, the emperor analyzed a piece which had just been brought out. It was Hector by Louis de Lanceval. This piece pleased him very much. It possessed warmth and energy of character. He called it a headquarter piece and said that a soldier would be better prepared to meet the enemy after seeing or reading it. He added that it would be well if there were a greater number of plays written in the same spirit, that adverting to those dramatic productions called drames in French, and which he termed waiting maids' tragedies. He said he would not bear more than one representation, after which they suffered a gradual diminution of interest. A good tragedy, on the contrary, gains upon every day. The higher walk of tragedy, continued he, is the school of great men. It is the duty of sovereigns to encourage and disseminate a taste for it. Nor is necessary, he said, to be a poet, to be enabled to judge of the merits of a tragedy. It is sufficient to be acquainted with men and things, to possess an elevated mind, and to be a statesman. Then, becoming gradually more animated, he added with enthusiasm, tragedy fires the soul, it elevates the heart, and is calculated to generate heroes. Considered under this point of view, perhaps France owes to Corneille a part of her great actions. And, gentlemen, had he lived in my time, I would have made him a prince. On a similar occasion, he analyzed and condemned the État de Blois, which had just been presented for the first time at the Theatre of the Court, and perceiving among the company present the Arch-Treasurer Lebrun, who was distinguished for his literary acquirements, he asked his opinion of it. Lebrun, who was undoubtedly in the author's interest, contented himself with remarking that the subject was a bad one. That, replied the emperor, was Monsieur Renoir's first fault. He chose it himself. It was not forced upon him. Besides, there is no subject, however bad, which great talent cannot turn to some account. And Corneille would still have been himself, even in one like this. As for Monsieur Renoir, he has totally failed. He has shown no other talent but that of versification. Everything else is bad, very bad. His conception, his details, his result are altogether deficient. He violates the truth of history. His characters are false, and their political tendencies dangerous and perhaps prejudicial. This is an additional proof of what, however, is very well known, that there is a wide difference between the reading and the representation of a play. I thought at first that this piece might have been allowed to pass. It was not until this evening that I perceived its improprieties. Of these, the praises lavished on the Bourbons are the least. The declamations against the revolutionists are much worse. Monsieur Renoir has made the chief of the 16 the Capuchin Chabot of the Convention. There is matter in his piece to gratify every party and every passion. Were I to allow it to be represented in Paris, I should probably hear of 100 people murdering one another in the pit. Besides, the author has made Aunt Henry IV a true filant, and the Duc de Guise a Figaro, which is by far too great an outrage on history. The Duc de Guise was one of the most distinguished men of his time, and if he had but ventured, he might at that time have established the 4th dynasty. Besides, he was related to the Empress. He was a prince of the House of Austria, with whom we are in friendship, and whose ambassador was present this evening at the representation. The author has in more than one instance shown a strange disregard of propriety. The emperor afterwards said that he felt more than ever fixed in the determination he had formed not to permit any new tragedy to be played on the public stage before it had undergone a trial at the theater of the court. He therefore prohibited the representation of the Etat de Blois. It is worthy of remark that since the restoration of the king, this piece was revived with the greatest pomp and supported by all the favor naturally procured for it. But notwithstanding all this, it failed. So correct was the judgment which Napoleon had passed upon it. Talma, the celebrated tragedian, had frequent interviews with the emperor, who greatly admired his talent and rewarded him magnificently. When the first consul became emperor, it was reported all over Paris that he had Talma give him lessons in attitude and costume. The emperor, who always knew everything that was said against him, rallied Talma one day on this subject, and finding him look quite disconcerted and confounded, "You are wrong," said he. "I certainly could not have employed myself better if I had leisure for it. On the contrary, it was the emperor who gave Talma lessons in his art. Racine," said he to him, "has loaded his character of Orestes with imbecilities, and you only add to their extravagance in the Mort de Pompey. You do not play Caesar like a hero. In Britannicus, you do not play Nero like a tyrant. Everyone knows the corrections which Talma afterwards made in his performances of these celebrated characters." The 29th. At 6 o'clock, the emperor, having finished his daily occupations, went out to walk in the garden. We then took a drive in the calash. It was quite dark and rained very fast when he returned. After dinner, while coffee was served round, which we took without rising from our seats at the dinner table, the conversation turned on what were termed agents. During the Revolution and the great fortunes which they acquired, the emperor knew the name, the family, the profession, and the character of every one of these men. Scarcely had Napoleon attained the consulship when he became engaged in a dispute with the celebrated Madame Récamier, whose father held a situation in the post office department. Napoleon, on first taking the reins of government, was obliged to sign in confidence a great number of lists, but he soon established the most rigid inspection in every department. He discovered that a correspondence with the Chouans was going on under the connivance of Monsieur Bernard, the father of Madame Récamier. He was immediately dismissed and narrowly escaped being brought to a trial, by which he would doubtless have been condemned to death. His daughter flew to the first consul, and at her solicitation, Napoleon exempted Monsieur Bernard from taking his trial, but was resolute with respect to his dismissal. Madame Recamier, who had been accustomed to ask for everything and to obtain everything, would be satisfied with nothing less than the reinstatement of her father. Such were the manners of those times. The severity of the first consul excited loud animadversions. It was a thing quite unusual. Madame Recamier and her party, which was very numerous, never forgave him. The contractors and agents were the class which above all excited the uneasiness of the new supreme magistrate, who called them the scourge and the plague of the nation. The emperor observed that all France would not have satisfied the ambition of the individuals of this party who were in Paris, that when he came to the head of affairs they constituted an absolute power, and that they were most dangerous to the state, whose springs were corrupted by their intrigues, joined to those of their numerous dependents. In truth, said he, they could never be regarded as anything but sources of corruption and ruin. Like Jews and usurers, they had disgraced the Directory, and they wished in like manner to control the consulate. It may be said that at that period they enjoyed the highest rank and influence in society. One of the principal retrograde steps, said the emperor, which I took with the view of restoring the past state and manners of society, was to throw all this false luster into the crowd. I never would raise any of this class to distinction of all aristocracies. This appeared to me the worst. The emperor rendered to Lebrun the justice of having especially confirmed him in this principle. The party always disliked me for this, said the emperor, but they were still less inclined to pardon the rigid inquiry which I instituted into their accounts with the government. The emperor said that in business of this sort he turned the service of his council state to the best account. He used to appoint a committee of 4 or 5 members of the council, men of integrity and intelligence. They made their report to him, and if the case required farther investigation, they wrote at the bottom of the report, referred to the grand judge to enforce the laws. The individuals implicated generally endeavored to compromise the affair. When it arrived to this length, they would disgorge 1, 2, 3, or 4 millions rather than suffer the business to be legally investigated. The emperor was well aware that all these facts were misrepresented in the different circles of the capital, that they produced him many enemies and drew down upon him the reproach of arbitrariness and tyranny. But he thus acquitted a great duty of the mass of society, who must have been grateful to him for the measures he adopted towards these bloodsuckers of the public. Men are always the same, said the emperor, from the time of Pharamond downwards. Contractors have always acted thus, and people have always acted in the same way towards to them. But at no period of the monarchy were they ever attacked in so legal a form or assailed so energetically and openly as by me. Even among the contractors themselves, the few individuals who possessed honesty and integrity found in this extreme severity a new guarantee for their own conduct. A remarkable instance of this occurred after my return from Elba. Some houses in London and Amsterdam secretly negotiated with me alone from 80 to 400 million at a profit of 7 or 8%. The neat sum which was deposited in the treasury of Paris was paid to them by rents on the Great Book of 50, which were then distributed among the public at 56 or 57. This resource, so useful in the crisis in which the emperor was placed, and which must at the same time have been so satisfactory and flattering to himself personally, proves the real opinion that was entertained of Napoleon in Europe and the confidence which he inspired. This negotiation, which was unknown at the time, explains whence the emperor derived the financial resources of which he suddenly found himself possessed on his return from Elba, which was a great subject of conjecture at the time. The emperor himself said that he enjoyed singular reputation among the heads of offices and accountants. The examination of accounts was the thing which he very well understood. The circumstance that first gained me reputation in this way was that while balancing a yearly account during the consulate, I discovered an error of 2 million to the disadvantage of the Republic. Monsieur Dufresne, who was then chief of the treasury and who was a perfectly honest man at first, would not believe that the error existed. However, it was an affair of figures. The fact could not be denied. At the treasury, several months were occupied in endeavoring to discover the error. It was at length found in an account of the contract of Seguin. who immediately acknowledged it on being shown the accounts and restored the money, saying it was a mistake. On another occasion, as the emperor was examining the accounts of the pay of the garrison of Paris, he observed an article of 60 and some odd thousand francs sent down to a detachment which had never been in the capital. The minister made a note of the error merely from complacence, but was convinced in his own mind that the emperor was mistaken. Napoleon, however, proved to be right, and the sum was restored. The emperor regarded as a matter of the highest importance the separation of the departments of finance and the treasury, both for the sake of keeping the business of the two departments distinct and for enabling them to become mutual checks to each other. The minister of the treasury under a sovereign like Napoleon was the most important man in the empire, not merely as minister of the treasury, but as comptroller general. All the accounts of the empire came under his examination, and he was thus enabled to detect every kind of peculation and abuse, and to make them known to the sovereign, and communications of this nature were daily made to special appropriations. Napoleon also attached the greatest importance as having been among the happiest springs of his administration. Speaking of the cadastre, he said that according to the plan which he had drawn up, it might be considered as the real constitution of the empire. It was the true guarantee of property and the security for the independence of each individual. For the tax being once fixed and established by the legislature, each individual might make his own arrangements and had nothing to fear from the authority or arbitrary conduct of assessors, which is always the point most sensibly felt and the surest to enforce submission. During this conversation, the emperor gave his opinion of the talents of Messieurs Godin, Moulin, and Louis, as well as most of his other ministers and counselors of state. He concluded by observing that he had succeeded in creating a system of administration doubtless the purest and most energetic in Europe, and that he himself had the details so much at his command that he was sure he now could, merely with the help of the moniteurs, trace a complete history of the financial transactions of the empire during his reign. March 1st. Today, 2 vessels arrived from the Cape. One, the Wellesley, a 74, had another dismantled ship in her hold. They were both Indian-built ships and were made of teak wood, 3/4 cheaper than they could have been built in England. This is an excellent kind of wood, and ships made of it are said to last much longer than European-built ships, though thereto it have been complained that they are not such good sailors. However, it is not improbable that this teak wood may produce a revolution in the materials and construction of English ships. Second, the China fleet has arrived. Several vessels successively entered the road in course of the day, and many others are within sight. This is a sort of festival and harvest for the people of St. Helena. The money which these transient visits circulate in the island constitutes the chief portion of the revenues of the inhabitants. At 5 o'clock, the emperor proceeded to the garden and went on foot as far as the opening between some of the hills, whence we could discern several vessels at full sail making for the island. The last ship that arrived from the Cape had brought a phaeton for the emperor. He wished to try it this evening, and he got into it accompanied by the Grand Marshal and rode round the park. He, however, thinks that this kind of equipage is both useless and ridiculous in present circumstance. After dinner, the emperor felt much fatigued. He has been indisposed for some days, and he retired this evening at an early hour. The 3rd, the emperor sent for me at 2 o'clock. I found him shaving. He told me that I beheld in him a man who was on the point of death, on the brink of the grave. He added that I must have been aware that he was ill, because he must have waked me often during the night. I had indeed heard him cough and sneeze continually. He had a violent cold in his head, which he had caught in consequence of staying out too long in the damp air on the preceding evening. He stated his determination in future always to return indoors at 6 o'clock. After he had dressed, he sat down to his English lesson, but he did not continue at it long, for his head ached severely. He told me to sit down by him and make me talk for more than 2 hours about what I had observed in London during my emigration. Among other things, he inquired, were the English very much afraid of my invasion? What was the general opinion at the time? Sire, I replied, I cannot inform you. I had then returned to France, but in the saloons of Paris we laughed heartily at the idea of an invasion of England, and the English who were there at the time did so too. It was said that even Brunet laughed at the scheme, and that you had caused him to be imprisoned because he had been insolent enough in one of his parts to set some nutshells afloat in a tub of water, which he called maneuvering his little flotilla. "Well," replied the emperor, "you might laugh in Paris, but Pitt did not laugh in London. He soon comprehended the extent of the danger, and therefore threw a coalition on my shoulders at the moment when I was raising my arm to strike. Never was the English oligarchy exposed to greater danger. I had taken measures to ensure the possibility of my landing. I had the best army in the world. I need only say it was the army of Austerlitz. In 4 days I should have been in London. I should have entered the English capital, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. I should have been another William III, but I would have acted with greater generosity and disinterestedness. The discipline of my army was perfect. My troops would have behaved in London just as they would have in Paris. No sacrifices, not even contributions, would have been exacted from the English. We should have presented ourselves to them, not as conquerors, but as brothers who came to restore them to their rights and liberties. I would have assembled the citizens and directed them to labor in the task of their regeneration, because the English had already preceded us in political legislation. I would have declared that our only wish was to be able to rejoice in the happiness and prosperity of the English people, and to these professions I would have strictly adhered. In the course of a few months, the two nations, which had been such determined enemies, would have henceforward composed only one people, identified in principles, maxims, and interests. I should have departed from England in order to effect from south to north, under republican colors, for I was then first consul, the regeneration of Europe, which at a latter period I was on the point of effecting from north to south under monarchical forms. Both systems are equally good, since both would have been attended by the same result, and would have been carried into execution with firmness, moderation, and good faith. How many ills that are now endured, how many that are yet to be experienced, would not unhappy Europe have escaped? Never was a project so favorable to the interests of civilization conceived with a more disinterested intention, or so near being carried into execution. It is a remarkable fact that the obstacles which occasioned my failure were not the work of men, but all proceeded from the elements. In the south, the sea frustrated my plans, the burning of Moscow, the snow in the winter completed my ruin in the north. Thus water, air, and fire, all nature, and nature alone, was hostile to the universal regeneration which nature herself called for. The problems of providence are insoluble.